Hello again. Thanks for joining us. This week's interview explores a different perspective on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Well, the latest round in the 12-nation talks came to a fiery end in Auckland at the weekend with a clash between protesters and the police outside the conference venue. Now, while we know what's going on outside the TPP talks, we still don't know precisely what's going on inside, where government and corporate representatives are working through what we're told is much more than a trade deal. Previously, we've covered issues causing concern here, but this time we're going to take a look at the issues that are causing concern in some quarters in the United States. Among the observers tracking the Auckland TPP talks was a Harvard-educated lawyer and former associate of consumer advocate Ralph Nader, who's been working to get the small print of the agreement into the public domain. Here's Dairne Shanahan with the founder and director of the US-based Public Citizens Global Trade Watch, Laurie Wallach.
Laurie Wallach, welcome to the studio and thank you for coming in. You've been called many things. Ralph Nader with a bigger sense of humour, the trade warrior, the guerrilla warrior, the Madame Defarge of Seattle. Do you scare the living daylights out of people with your knowledge of this particular field?
I don't know that I scare them. I know a lot about these issues, and I have the benefit of a Harvard Law degree and training to really get into the details. But I also bring a fairly sarcastic humor, and a lot of what I do is translate these technical trade pacts into what they mean for people's lives. So I suppose I probably don't make happy the big corporations are trying to pretend that these are very good for all of us and just trade and we should all be happy. I probably don't scare most Americans who want to know what the heck is really going on.
Mm. Where did the passion come from? What's the early point in your life where you developed this interest?
You know, it's a very interesting story. I wasn't someone who was a trade activist. In fact, in a way, I'm too old to be. The whole fair trade movement or the Seattle protests, I was already a grown-up. What ended up happening is I was actually out of law school. I'd worked in Capitol Hill. I worked in political campaigns. I worked in television news.
What did you want to do when you went to law school, though? What was your...
I wasn't exactly sure what a lawyer did, but my whole life everyone had said, you have to go to law school. Because even like in grade school, if there would be a dispute, I would be the person who would come in and sort of say, all right, what I hear you saying is this, but your argument is that. Therefore. So from a very early stage, people sort of said, all right, that one, to my father said, start putting away money. There's going to be a lawyer here. So I wasn't exactly sure what lawyers did. There weren't any in my family, but I had some kind of a sense between sort of the Brown versus Board of Education, which is our big, civil rights desegregation case that's in my generation of time the most transformative case. Some cross between that and, I don't know, Perry Mason, the notion of lawyers go to court every day.
Yeah.
But I had an idea I wanted to do something for social justice, to be involved in policy. And so I came back to Washington, where I'd worked in Capitol Hill for a congressman after law school.
What kind of an experience was that?
Working for the congressman?
Yeah.
Eye-opening. It was still a very sexist place, and so to some degree I had gotten into Harvard Law School. I deferred, and after being there for a while I decided I would get the degree because it was as close as you were going to get was having the Harvard Law degree to being a boy. So it was going to be a very useful credential in Washington to have that. So I went, and it was eye-opening to see how things really happened. It was a very different time than it is even now, and it's, not 30 years ago.
We're talking about the early 90s.
80s.
80s.
The 80s. Mm. And it's much more polarized, and people don't live in Washington, the members of Congress don't, so they don't really talk to each other. They have sort of 3-day windows where they sort of clash and then split. But that being said, I came back and I was working for Public Citizen, which, I had loved as a group that works on campaign finance.
Yes, well, this is
founded by
Nader.
Ralph Nader,
Yeah.
founded by him.
Yeah.
And I wanted to work on campaign finance reform because there was so much corporate money in our system. And so, but they didn't have exactly that job. So I was there actually working, doing advocacy on food safety, what we call the human environment. So everything but animals. So clean water, clean air, no toxics, pesticides in food. And I was testifying about food safety bills to Congress. And I was there testifying to the congressman. And it's very interesting because the guy from the Cattlemen's Beef Association, Big Beef, and somebody from another consumer group were there. And my role was basically to take a hard line on fixing this piece of legislation. And the cattleman's guy was basically saying the new legislation, which was just going to have country of origin labeling for meat, it wasn't a huge deal, would destroy the entire farm economy. And he didn't do the thing he was expected. Instead, he just looked at the congressman and he said, you can pass it, but it won't be allowed under the World Trade Organization. And I thought,
Did you know at that stage what the World Trade Organization was?
I knew about GATT, the General Agreement on
Yes.
Tariffs and Trade, and
Yeah.
I knew there was a negotiation. I didn't know the world, I think at that point it was called the Multilateral Trade Organization, so I didn't know what that was precisely, but I had
Yeah.
an idea. Stuck in the back of my head. About 2 months later, I was working on a pesticide bill, testifying at a different congressional committee, and there the Chemical Manufacturers Association guy says, well, Congressman, you can improve that bill to make sure that young kids aren't exposed to pesticides, but that won't be allowed under NAFTA. Now, I did know what NAFTA was. Why are they talking about trade agreements? When I studied in law school, trade agreements were about tariffs. They were about border taxes, tariffs, about physical things that moved between countries and what you did at the border. Basically, if you couldn't drop it on your foot,
Yeah.
it was not covered in these agreements. So I thought, why are they talking about domestic policies? So I started snooping around, didn't really find anything out. I went back to my boss at the time and I said, there is some backdoor sneak attack going on. I am like the person in charge of food safety. I am watching the front door of the bank and I'm very serious about it. And right over my shoulder, there is a trap door, something related to trade, where everything I'm supposed to be guarding is getting snagged out the door. And my boss at the time said, you've worked too hard, you should take a vacation, you might be having issues. So I took that week off and I actually found somebody in Minnesota who had had a leave of absence and had gone over to Brussels and had a leaked copy of the WTO text. And so all of a sudden,
So
there
at
it
that
was.
stage it was secret.
It was totally secret. There it was, and I'm reading this thinking, and I knew a lot about food safety law at that point, and I'm reading the food safety chapter thinking, this cannot be for real. I mean, what do you mean secret tribunals could second guess our domestic laws? For what reason? Because it's written in some damn so-called trade agreement? And what do you mean if we don't get rid of our pesticide, food labeling, inspection, safety laws? We're going to face trade sanctions? Even if we treat domestic and foreign stuff the same? Like, who elected them God and put a ceiling on my food safety? That's ridiculous. That's not democratic. So I hauled the text back to Washington and plunked it down on my boss's table. I said, I may be paranoid, but there's something going on. And I kept chewing and chewing about this. And I started on top of what I was supposed to be doing, working around the margins of trying to find what was going on. At the same time, Ralph Nader was chewing on the big boss of the organization, the president, and saying, there's this very undemocratic thing called fast track. It's this huge delegation of authority that Richard Nixon originally cooked up to sneak trade agreements around the constitutional authority that Congress and our system has of trade. When our negotiators make a deal here, it doesn't mean anything. It's not a parliamentary system. If it's not approved by Congress, it can go right into the waste bin. So Ralph was watching the process and thought, there must be something very bad that they want this legislative luge run to get this thing through Congress. So while he was talking about the process, I was talking about the substance, and eventually both of the big boss and my boss said, let's put the two nuts together. They can talk to each other about trade, and then they won't be talking to us. So one day I got marched over to Ralph's office, and I was sort of, oh, my hero. And he said, I hear you think there's some backdoor sneak attack of corporations pretending they're negotiating trade agreements, but really undermining our democratic policies. And at that moment I thought, well, you're Ralph Nader. In fact, you must know that's true, right? And he said, that one will do, you can leave now. And so I got left there for a while, and we started working together, and that was the beginning of Public Citizen getting involved on a whole set of trade and globalization issues. The North American Free Trade Agreement, the World Trade Organization, where we really came to realize that 30 years of Public Citizen's advocacy on strong environmental and consumer and health policies, safe medicines, stable banking, etc., all of that was on the chopping table.
It was going to mean nothing.
Behind closed doors. Instead of a discussion at Congress or a state legislature, it was over here. Outside of our discussion, decisions were going to be made in these international venues where the people living with the decisions weren't going to have any role in the decisions being made or the future ability to change it. So we suddenly saw this as an assault on democracy and got involved.
Okay, so who were these people who were doing it at that time?
So under the U.S. fast track system that Nixon cooked up, there are about 600 officially designated corporate advisors. They have security clearance, they get to see the text, and they advise the United States Trade Representative. That is a very small but very smart agency that's appointed by the president. The top people are. It's a bunch of very focused lawyers. The problem is they see their constituency as those 600 advisors, of whom there are 20 perhaps, who are unions or consumer or environmental groups. Everyone else is business. So their whole perspective is we have to do what the businesses are thinking about. So for instance, instead of thinking even about how do we create US jobs with our trade agreements, they're thinking how do we help US firms try to relocate to other countries and make sure that their investments are safe? How do we have the service sector take over banks and healthcare systems? And they're not really thinking domestically. They never think as the defendant. They always think as the aggressor. So our work was basically to start originally going around to different organizations and saying, you know, that wonderful law you passed, Sierra Club, guess what? The WTO could sack it. Please pay attention. It's not about trade anymore. Or going to the other consumer groups and saying, yes, the theory of trade is more choice, lower prices. But look at these rules. Here's protectionism. Here is in a free trade agreement an extension of monopoly patents that's going to expand the cost to consumers of medicines. Or here are rules that would limit the product safety standards we've all fought for to make sure our cars don't blow up underneath us. And eventually, as we went to different organizations, and the more we studied the different parts of the agreement, we realized this was a whole enforceable system of governance, largely of, by, and for corporations. To
So
which
democracy
we would
was
be bound.
going out the back door as well.
We'd be bound. I mean, the binding provision is countries shall ensure the conformity of domestic laws, regulations, and administrative procedures, and then it's enforceable. So, I mean, everyone who has ever thought about human rights or labor rights, please let there be enforceable standards, and they're not. The International Labor Organization or the United Nations Human Rights Treaties have great substance, but they're not enforceable. Here was a whole body of law that actually would be enforceable through trade sanctions if you didn't change your domestic laws. So in very short order, we were running to Congress saying, this isn't just a trade agreement. Don't vote like this is a trade agreement.
And what was the reaction?
You know, for the first 2 or 3 years, people thought we were crazy, or they thought we were sneaky protectionists. And I remember, you know, it was humorous because Ralph Nader is one of the guys who had advocated for access for Japanese cars to the US market. They were safer, more reliable, etc. So I remember Ralph going to the lion of the Senate liberals, Senator Kennedy, God rest his soul.
So, yeah.
And he was one of the big champions in making sure the pharmaceutical companies didn't get extensions of patents. They kept trying in Congress.
Yeah.
And he wanted drugs to be affordable for people. That was his life quest. And Ralph said to him, Senator Kennedy, this is not your brother's GATT. This is not just trade liberalization. There's a rewrite of our patent laws in here that pharmaceutical companies would finally get their extended patent. And I remember Senator Kennedy saying, no, it's not possible. It's a trade agreement. No, sir, really, read this. That's not possible. I'm the senator. I would know. It's my committee.
But that's been one of the whole bogey points of the whole system because nobody can read and understand what's going on. I mean, you can interpret it.
The
but
day
lots of people
after the
can't.
vote, front page of the Wall Street Journal, Big Pharma get 20-year monopoly, finally. And Senator Kennedy calls up Ralph Nader and says, how could you have let that go through? We've been fighting this for 20 years. And Ralph said, no, sir, really, that was in the WTO. That was the U.S. conforming itself to the WTO. We weren't kidding. That really was the obligation. And by the way, we now have to accept imports of foods that don't meet our standards, which was another thing that got thrown out, the Meat Act. And we have to do this and we have to do that. Each time, either a law a member of Congress or an organization loves is thrown out in a trade agreement, or is ruled against and gets destroyed because of the sanctions, more people convert to understanding what it's really about. To the point that now, almost 20 years into NAFTA, there are vast majorities of Democrats, Republicans, and independents who all oppose more NAFTAs. We now have gotten to that.
But in terms of the recent elections, it was very little about NAFTA.
Oh,
In terms of the debate, no?
The ads.
The ads were there.
The ads.
But do you look at the debate between the president and Mitt Romney? It was hardly mentioned. They were punching at China.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting situation because what's happened systematically is the very top of each party has gotten into the exact same bipartisan pro-NAFTA position. So neither of them want to talk about it because they're here and the whole American public is someplace else, except for the very wealthiest of the wealthy. So they both have sort of a conspiracy of convenience of not talking about the thing that they both know a majority of Democrats, Republicans, and independents oppose them on. And that's why the China issue is easier because you don't have to, it's a forward issue, you don't have to say
Yeah.
what you thought
Yeah.
about that thing that everyone
Yeah.
hates. However, what's really interesting is we did a study after the election, and there was a flood of ads in congressional elections, basically anti-NAFTAing each other. So I hate NAFTA more than the other guy. I mean, there were literally Democrats and Republicans who were dueling to see who could say they were the most anti-NAFTA, including some who had voted for similar agreements in the past. Or, my opponent supports trade agreements that offshore jobs. My opponent supports 3 trade agreements that offshore jobs. My opponent is 4 trade agreements. And they were going back and forth in competing ads. That's how bad the idea of a NAFTA-style trade agreement has gotten in U.S. politics because of the lived experience.
All right, so what have been the ramifications of NAFTA for Americans living there? I mean, you look at America and you say, you know, good standard of living, everybody's got a job, except, you know, bad times at the moment, bit of a recession, you know, farmers are happy, they're well looked after, everybody's well looked after, the poor, not so, you know, but Obama's doing something for healthcare. What's happening?
Is that the reputation we have on the outside? Because that's not what it's like on the inside. I mean, the most noticeable thing in our country is our entire manufacturing sector has been destroyed. So since NAFTA and the World Trade Organization accession, which were in 1994 and 1995, the U.S. has lost 1 out of every 4 of our manufacturing jobs in less than 20 years. Gone. 5 million plus manufacturing jobs, 40,000 manufacturing facilities. So we went from one of the world's manufacturing powerhouses to be basically hollowed out, to a point where not only have we seen all those jobs being lost, but also we can't even make key things we need. So I'm sure you saw the news here a couple years ago in that horrible bridge crash in Twin Cities. We had to wait for the steel to come to fix the bridge. We don't make that anymore. We were the world's largest steel producer. So we have seen the workers who are in those manufacturing jobs go into the service sector economy, and they have lost, on average, according to our Department of Labor, $6,000 in wages. So we've seen an enormous decline in wages. We've seen a lot of increase in inequality. So, and that, by the way, is a prediction of free trade theory. But how this happened is not just the trade parts of the agreement. Actually, it's the investment chapters, and that is what is being pushed to be replicated and even expanded
In the
TPP,
yeah.
the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
And you see that as a disaster.
Well, the way that chapter works, you know, there's good old competition where you decide, all right, I have pros and cons of making it here and investing it and shipping it there, or making it here and shipping it back, and then you do the balance. What the investment chapter does is it takes away the risks and the costs of relocating to the lowest wage venue, producing in one unified place, and then shipping it long distance around the world, because it guarantees a level of special treatment if you relocate as the foreign investor better than the domestic companies in a country, and
So
better
it
than
pays
you
you
had
go
at home.
short.
You get compensation for regulatory costs. You don't have to rely on domestic courts. You can go into lopsided corporate tribunals for your disputes with the government. And so we literally saw U.S. companies moving to Canada, where there were slightly higher wages, just to get all the investor benefits under those incentives. We saw a flood of companies go to Mexico, where it was seen as too risky to invest. It was $6 a day wages compared to, you know, U.S. union wages of $10 or $12 an hour, and the relocation was by the millions of jobs. Now, what's tragic is, of course, then when China entered the WTO, a bunch of those jobs left Mexico and went to China. So now, all these years, NAFTA went into effect in '94. Almost 20 years after NAFTA, Mexico has less manufacturing jobs than it did before
Than
NAFTA.
it did before, yeah.
Now, we're hollowed out. They're a little bit lower than they were. In addition, scores of domestic policies have been challenged in the investor tribunals. So
Give me an example.
almost $400 million have been paid out, and the string of cases is all over. They are not trade cases. So for instance, Canada had banned a gasoline additive. It's toxic. It's banned in the U.S. The U.S. company that made it went to one of these tribunals, said, you can't do that. We're a foreign investor. They got $13 million cash from the Canadian government. They got the ban lifted, and they got an advertising statement that this toxic chemical, it doesn't say that, this chemical is safe for the health and the environment. Mexico, for instance, had put up a ban on the operation of a particular toxic waste dump when it was owned by a Mexican company. It polluted the water system. Mexican company didn't have the money to clean it up and couldn't have an operating license until it was cleaned up, so they sold it very cheaply to a U.S. company called Metalclad. Metalclad then went to the government and said, we're the U.S. investor now, we get the license, we're opening it. Mexican government said, we're going to treat you exactly the same as the previous Mexican owner.
So clean it up.
Clean it up. You got it for nothing. You'll still make a lot of money, just clean it up and you have the capital. They said, no, we don't have to do that. We're a foreign investor under NAFTA. We have special rights. They got $17 million for not cleaning it up, and they walked away never having invested a dime. It was a huge toxic mess after putting in very little money and walked away with that profit. That case actually was one of the cases that then led to an attempt, because it was so outrageous, to limit those rules. But it didn't limit them. The cases just rolled on. So another case, one that's probably fairly relevant for here, is there have been a whole series of U.S. and actually Canadian firms using CAFTA, the Central America Free Trade Agreement, which came next, to attack mining policy and water use policy and timber policy and zoning and land use, so that if you do all the U.S. trade agreements, it's over $3 billion paid out to corporations. $400 million just for NAFTA. And none of it is normal expropriations. It's not the government coming and taking your land. It's all issues like environment, toxic bans, etc.
Seems incredible, doesn't it? The AIDS conference in Washington, just recently in August, right? There were many there who protested. They came from right around the world protesting to the drug companies about what they're trying to do with the generic drugs that many of the poorer countries are using to treat people with AIDS, and also lots of other issues as well, not just AIDS, other medical conditions. What was the take on that?
Well, this is another way that these trade agreements aren't about trade. So the U.S. pharmaceutical companies have largely called the shots in the U.S. trade agreements, and they push for two things. They push for extensions of the patents. So when they got us to 20 years, that's not enough. They want to push for another 10 years of what's called exclusivity of the testing data. So even once the patent is up, you can't get approved to have a generic for another 10 years. They get their monopoly price for 10 more years. It's a total scandal, and that's been in the past U.S. free trade agreements. In addition, they've started this attack on medicine formularies like Pharmac, or the Pharmaceutical Benefit Scheme in Australia. And one of the big pushes for TPP is to basically get a right for any U.S. pharmaceutical company to come challenge the decisions of Pharmac. So you'll have Pharmac on paper, but the paper is going to be with holes in the middle. Because instead of having the lower prices, you're basically going to have the big U.S. companies saying, oh, that's what you think because you're doctors and pharmacologists, but we're the company, we should get paid more or else. Their goal basically is to break the cap on Pharmac so that they could get a bigger profit out of it.
Do you think they'll succeed?
Well, you know, I would really hope that your elected officials in New Zealand wouldn't trade that away, because to be honest, you're not going to get much of anything out of this.
Our Minister of Trade has already said he's open to negotiation because the Americans are in a tough spot.
That was one of the most peculiar and horrifying things I've ever seen in print. And actually, not just that he would open it, but that he was recognizing that the Americans had an economic and political interest in having this issue resolved. That's the craziest thing I've ever heard. Number one, the economic interest. Our pirate-like pharmaceutical companies should all be put in jail, not be given more of your money. I mean, they're taking it right out of our pockets. You should not join that club. Believe me, it's miserable. But number two, they have a political problem. He should know from political problems. The political problem is the way this agreement is heading with the foreign tribunals, with the limits on financial regulation, with all of the crazy limits on internet freedom. I don't think this agreement would get through our Congress, and they sure as heck aren't going to give New Zealand any dairy access. So when I hear him say this, I'm thinking...
But we're told it's going to be millions of jobs. We're going to be happiness-filled.
Well, this is the thing. There clearly is one public relations firm that is advising all the TPP heads of state, because there's one thing you do. You say, this agreement will increase economic growth and create jobs. Reset. This agreement will create economic growth and create jobs. Reset. You do it in all the languages and all the accents. They're all saying the same thing. And there is simply no empirical data. I mean, when it comes to the study they're kicking around here, I looked into it. It is a footnote in a study that has almost no reference to New Zealand. The number's actually $3 billion, which has now been doubled to $3 billion. And you know something? That's not for TPP. That is for an all APEC free trade agreement that includes Russia, China, and all the other countries, that zeroes out all tariffs. not a country, an agreement between 11 countries, one of whom is the U.S., who, I mean, here's just the, all hyperbole aside, there are 50 states in which the U.S. has a dairy industry. This is a history of our old dairy bill, the Section 22 programs, that every state, every congressional district has this interest. So there's some issues where the U.S. government negotiators can throw a sector under the bus.
Yeah.
Because it's, all right, those are 3 states, they're always Republican, we're a Democratic administration. Tough for them, that's their industry, we'll get good things. With dairy, you can't do that. So I came to New Zealand with these letters, basically to try and warn people not to give away things like Pharmac, for God's sakes, because you're not going to get anything. And I have a letter that has half of the U.S. Senate on it. People who never get in the same piece of paper together because they hate each other. They don't agree with anything.
Saying,
I call
"Don't
it
do
the pillar of salt letter. Because these are people who could not be in each other's presence, and they're all saying, we'll vote together against any TPP that is dairy. So why? I mean, I have to ask, really, why is New Zealand in this negotiation? You have some of the most to risk on investor state also.
So your advice to New Zealand would be out?
Yeah, I would say basically there is no upside in this that is worth trading away things like your Pharmac, control of your farmland.
Why is America wanting to come down here, though? Is it really, are they in the game with China?
What's the real
push
reason?
and shove?
Yeah, I mean, they're two. Our government is split on this within the executive branch. The Congress is split about 50 ways about this. But in the executive branch, the State Department sees this as a tool to bash China over the head. And of course, you've seen President Obama, even as recently as 2 weeks ago, post-election, with his whole business of this will exert our power, we're a Pacific power, it's part of our pivot.
We're coming down here to
We're putting
take
pressure
over.
on China, we're going to set the rules for the Pacific. That's the State Department version. But then the Commerce Department and the Trade Representative's version, this is not to be insulting, but is not actually even focused on New Zealand. You guys are sort of innocent bystanders. It's focused on Vietnam, it's focused on Malaysia, and down the road it's trying to get Russia, it's trying to get Indonesia. And
Japan.
Their strategy is NAFTA on steroids, über alles. They want to get that whole array of non-trade corporate rights superglued, tacked, nailed, welded across the Pacific, so that every other country is basically in these lunatic handcuffs of these agreements. Because, you know, while you can change statutory law, you have an election, you realize, Rogernomics, not so good. We should change some things. In these agreements, you can't change a comma unless every other country agrees.
And New Zealand will not see it in their parliament until it's signed and done deal.
Which is horrifying. I mean, it's horrifying. I mean, for all of the problems with our Congress and its checks and balances getting things done, one of the good things is the oversight they can bring to trade agreements, which is also why I'm always running around to other countries warning, hello, we're not a parliamentary system.
How do you keep going?
You know, we win. We win when the sunshine gets on these agreements. So I sort of think of myself as sort of a professional translator, because when people understand what is being done to them under the misbrand of trade agreement, frequently and repeatedly, people stand up and they actually say, I won't put up with it. So there was supposed to be this exact thing as TPP called the Free Trade Area of the Americas, but even bigger, 34-country NAFTA expansion, all of Latin America and the Caribbean. 7-year campaign of people becoming aware of what it really was about. Brand was trade, agenda otherwise. Ultimately, that thing was stopped because of citizen activism. And the thing for people in New Zealand to know, it was some of the small countries, Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago, as well as Brazil and Argentina, basically beat Goliath. And Goliath was a combination of the US and Canada bullying everyone, plus a bunch of big companies. Why? Because it became politically unviable. People learned what it meant. Yeah, then we may or may not get anything economically, but it's not worth the cost of what it means to us, essentially, on these other grounds.
Laurie, good luck. Thank you very much indeed.
Dairne Shanahan with Laurie Wallach, the director of the Public Citizens Global Trade Watch. And that's all for now. We're back in a week with more of the nation's newsmakers. Till then, thanks for your company. See you next time.
Supporting local content so you can see more of New Zealand on air.